There exists a particular kind of wounding that leaves no visible marks, no evidence that could be presented in any court of human understanding. It arrives through subtle withdrawals of warmth, through conversations that somehow always circle back to your inadequacies, through silences that communicate more devastation than any raised voice ever could. You leave these encounters carrying something heavy that was not yours to begin with, a weight that settles into your bones and whispers that perhaps you are indeed too much, too sensitive, too difficult to love properly. The world operates on an economy of emotional transactions that most people never consciously recognize. Every interaction becomes a negotiation where your worth gets recalculated based on how much space you take up, how many needs you express, how often you require reciprocal care. Those who have learned to make themselves small, to anticipate needs before expressing their own, to smooth over conflicts before they fully form. These souls become the preferred currency in relationships that thrive on imbalance. When you remain silent about your pain, when you swallow the words that might disturb someone else's comfort, you create a precedent that echoes through every future interaction. Your silence becomes an expectation, then a requirement, then finally a prison whose bars you helped forge through your own compliance. The people around you learn unconsciously that your needs are negotiable while theirs remain fixed, that your boundaries are suggestions while theirs are walls. Consider the anatomy of emotional dismissal. Someone speaks over you and you let it pass. They forget promises made to you, but remember every slight against them. They respond to your joy with indifference, but expect celebration for their smallest victories. Each instance seems minor, forgettable, not worth the conflict that naming it would create. Yet these moments accumulate like sediment, building layers of proof that your experiences matter less than your ability to absorb theirs. The shadow that psychological theory speaks of is not some dark creature lurking in your unconscious depths. It is the accumulated power you have denied yourself permission to express. Every time you felt anger but showed understanding instead. Every moment you wanted to leave but stayed to avoid seeming difficult. Every boundary you wanted to set but abandoned for the sake of harmony. These became deposits in the shadow account. This is not weakness masquerading as strength, but strength that has been mislabeled as dangerous. Your body keeps meticulous records of every betrayal of self. That tightness in your chest when certain people call, the exhaustion that follows seemingly normal conversations, the way your shoulders rise when particular topics emerge, these are not anxiety symptoms, but accuracy. Your nervous system recognizes threats that your conscious mind has been trained to rationalize away. What gets labeled as oversensitivity is often the precise calibration of a system that has learned to detect danger in its subtlest forms. The apologetic reflex that emerges when you express any need or boundary reveals the depth of conditioning that preceded it. You find yourself prefacing truths with softening statements, following boundaries with explanations, cushioning every assertion of self with reassurance that you are not trying to be difficult. This linguistic dance of self-minimization was choreographed long before you were conscious enough to refuse the lessons, taught through examples of what happened to those who spoke without apology. Love, as you learned to recognize it, came dressed in the clothing of endurance. If someone stayed despite your flaws, that was love. If they tolerated your emotions, that was care. If they occasionally met your needs after you had proven yourself worthy through meeting theirs consistently, that was devotion. This blueprint of connection, drawn in childhood and reinforced through repetition, created a template where suffering became indistinguishable from affection. The mask of agreeability that you fashioned to navigate these dynamics eventually fused so completely with your daily presentation that removing it felt like removing skin. You became the one who never complained, who always understood, who could find the silver lining in any cloud of dysfunction. This performance earned you praise and inclusion, but the cost was a gradual forgetting of who existed beneath the costume. Each time someone crossed a boundary, and you allowed it to pass without consequence, you taught them a lesson neither of you consciously registered. You communicated that your stated limits were merely suggestions, that your no could be negotiated into maybe, and eventually into yes, if enough pressure was applied. The boundary existed in words, but dissolved in practice, and it was the practice that people remembered and responded to in future interactions. The emotional labor you perform without reciprocation creates a particular form of depletion that goes unrecognized because it leaves no visible evidence. You hold space for others' feelings while yours remain unwitnessed. You process their experiences, offer insights, provide comfort, manage their emotional states, and somehow this becomes labeled as friendship or love rather than what it truly is: an extraction that flows in only one direction. Recognition does not automatically grant someone access to your inner world. There are those who can map your wounds with startling accuracy, who understand your patterns and triggers with intimate precision, yet who use this knowledge not for healing but for manipulation. They know exactly which buttons to push, which words will make you doubt yourself, which approaches will bypass your defenses. Understanding without integrity becomes a weapon disguised as intimacy. The hypervigilance that develops from navigating these dynamics gets misdiagnosed as anxiety when it is actually adaptation. You learn to scan faces for micro-expressions of disapproval, to parse sentences for hidden criticism, to anticipate needs before they were expressed, to avoid being seen as failing. This exhausting state of constant alertness was not paranoia, but pattern recognition born from experience. The frozen moment when you finally speak truth instead of accommodation marks a boundary between who you were and who you are becoming. Your voice might shake, your hands might tremble, but something fundamental shifts when you refuse to explain away someone else's harmful behavior. The person across from you registers this change immediately, though they might not consciously understand what has happened. You have stepped outside the choreography they memorized, and now they must improvise. The backlash arrives wrapped in familiar accusations. You have become difficult, they say, different from who you used to be. What they cannot articulate is that your transformation threatens the comfortable dynamic where their needs naturally took precedence. Your newfound clarity sounds like betrayal to ears accustomed to your previous compliance. They mourn not the loss of you, but the loss of the version of you that required so little while providing so much. Consider how loyalty to dysfunction masquerades as virtue in countless relationships. You stay through treatment that diminishes you, calling it commitment. You absorb anger that belongs elsewhere, calling it understanding. You sacrifice your well-being on the altar of someone else's comfort, calling it love. But remaining in situations that steadily erode your sense of self is not noble. It represents a fundamental confusion between endurance and care, between self-abandonment and genuine connection. The cultural mythology around unconditional love has created generations of people who cannot distinguish between healthy attachment and trauma bonding. True love includes conditions: respect, reciprocity, growth, safety. When someone demands your endless forgiveness while offering no accountability, when they require your constant availability while remaining emotionally absent themselves, they are not seeking love but dominance disguised in the language of intimacy. Your sensitivity to emotional atmospheres, that quality others have labeled as excessive or problematic, actually represents a finely tuned instrument for detecting truth. When you walk into a room and immediately sense tension despite surface, pleasantries when someone's words say one thing while their energy communicates another, when you feel exhausted after interactions that appeared normal, your system is providing accurate data about reality. The problem was never your sensitivity, but the insistence that you ignore its messages. The over-explanation that emerges when you set even the simplest boundary reveals how deeply you have internalized the belief that your needs require justification. You find yourself building elaborate cases for why you cannot attend an event, why you need space, why something hurt you, as though your feelings need to pass through committee approval before being validated. This exhausting practice of preemptive defense assumes that your natural responses are inherently suspect. When healing begins to change your responses and reactions, the people who knew only your wounded patterns experience this as loss. They had organized their behavior around your predictable compliance, your reliable availability, your consistent prioritization of their comfort. As you evolve beyond these patterns, they must either grow alongside you or reveal their investment in your limitation. Most will choose revelation over revolution. The particular cruelty of withdrawn affection as punishment operates through its plausible deniability. They are not openly hostile. They simply become distant. They do not explicitly reject you. They just stop responding with warmth. This emotional withholding creates a panic in those trained to earn love through performance, sending them scrambling to identify what they did wrong, how they can fix it, what they must sacrifice to restore the connection. But love that can be withdrawn was never love. It was a commodity exchanged for compliance. The death of the false self does not happen in a single dramatic moment, but through thousands of small choices to honor truth over comfort. Each time you say no without apology, each time you leave rather than endure, each time you choose your well-being over someone else's convenience, another piece of the constructed identity falls away. What remains might initially feel naked and vulnerable, but this is simply what authenticity feels like to those who have lived in costume. The projection that occurs when others accuse you of the very behaviors they exhibit reveals the unconscious operations of shadow dynamics. The person who calls you selfish when you set boundaries is revealing their own selfishness in expecting unlimited access. The one who labels you as difficult when you stop accommodating is showing their difficulty with respecting autonomy. These accusations are confessions disguised as criticisms. Some individuals remain connected to you, specifically because your dysfunction validates their own. Your anxiety makes their anxiety seem normal. Your self-doubt provides cover for their insecurity. Your willingness to accept less creates space for them to offer less. When you begin healing, addressing these patterns, developing self-worth, you disturb the equilibrium of mutual limitation that the relationship required. The addiction to chaos that characterizes certain personalities means they experience peace as threat. If you are no longer in crisis, they cannot play savior. If you are no longer anxious, they cannot be the calm one. If you are no longer broken, they cannot avoid examining their own fractures. Your stability destabilizes them because their identity was built on being needed by someone perpetually in need. The enforcement of boundaries requires no explanation beyond their existence. The compulsion to justify, to make others understand, to gain agreement for your limits, reveals a belief that boundaries are negotiable propositions rather than declarations of sovereignty. When someone pushes against your boundary and demands explanation, they are not seeking understanding, but looking for weak points to exploit. The gravitational pull of self-concept creates a kind of psychological magnetism that attracts confirming experiences. If your deep belief is that you must earn love through service, you will unconsciously be drawn to those who demand service without reciprocation. If your inner narrative says you are too much, you will find those who consistently communicate that you should be less. The universe does not conspire to hurt you. It simply reflects back the story you tell yourself about what you deserve. The moment healing begins to transform your internal landscape, the external world responds with immediate resistance. Those who had organized their lives around your predictable wounds suddenly find themselves disoriented, unable to locate you in the old patterns. They search for the familiar triggers that once guaranteed specific responses, but find only empty space where dysfunction once resided. This absence disturbs them more than your pain ever did. The evolution of love requires constant renegotiation of terms. Yet many relationships operate on contracts written in invisible ink decades ago. When one person begins growing beyond the original agreement, developing new needs, discovering different values, expanding their sense of possibility, the other faces a choice. They can either stretch to meet this growth or dig their heels into familiar ground. Most choose the familiar, then blame the growing person for changing the rules. People who benefited from your lack of boundaries experience your newfound limits as personal attacks. They had built their comfort on unlimited access to your time, energy, and emotional resources. Now doors that were always open require knocking. Spaces that were freely entered need permission. Resources that flowed without question now come with conditions. To them, your self-protection feels like punishment for crimes they do not believe they committed. The exhaustion of over-explanation serves those who profit from confusion. They ask why repeatedly, not seeking understanding, but looking for points of entry, weak spots in your reasoning where they can insert doubt. Each explanation you provide becomes material for further questioning, creating endless loops of justification that drain your energy while never reaching satisfaction. Clarity threatens their control precisely because it cannot be manipulated through misunderstanding. Empathy without boundaries becomes a form of self-sacrifice that masquerades as virtue. You feel others' pain so acutely that it overrides your own needs. You absorb their emotions until you cannot distinguish between what belongs to you and what you have taken on. This boundless compassion might seem noble, but it creates a dynamic where you exist primarily as a repository for others' unwanted feelings, a healing space for everyone except yourself. The burning desire to be understood can trap you in relationships with those committed to misperception. You craft elaborate explanations, provide context and history, clarify your intentions repeatedly, yet somehow the message never lands. This is not a failure of communication, but a revelation of investment. Some people maintain their misunderstanding because it serves them, because your true self would require them to change their behavior. When someone crosses your stated boundary and then becomes offended by your response, they reveal an entitlement so deep they cannot conceive of your autonomy. They expected access regardless of your stated limits. They assumed their desire would override your no. The anger they display when confronted with your boundary enforcement is not about the boundary itself, but about their shocked recognition that you are indeed separate from them. The guilt that emerges when you outgrow relationships reveals how thoroughly you have been trained to prioritize others, comfort over your own evolution. You feel responsible for their disappointment, as though your growth is a betrayal rather than a natural progression. But staying small to avoid disturbing others is not kindness. It represents a fundamental confusion between love and limitation, between care and cage. The departure of people when you develop self-respect exposes what they valued in the relationship. They did not leave because you became difficult, but because you became sovereign. Your availability for exploitation ended. Your willingness to accept minimal reciprocity expired. Your tolerance for disrespect reached its limit. Their exit is not judgment on your worth, but revelation of their intentions. Triggers carry messages from parts of yourself that remember what your conscious mind has learned to forget. When someone's behavior creates a disproportionate emotional response, when certain words pierce deeper than their surface meaning suggests, when particular situations flood you with feelings that seem to belong to another time, your system is recognizing patterns that once meant danger. These responses are not overreactions, but precise reactions to subtle similarities. The projection dynamics that operate in relationships create a hall of mirrors where everyone sees their own unconscious material reflected in others. The person who accuses you of manipulation when you set boundaries might be revealing their own manipulative intentions. The one who calls you controlling when you express needs might be exposing their need for control. These accusations become confessions when understood through the lens of projection. Addiction to dysfunction operates like any other dependency, creating a need for escalating doses to achieve the same effect. Those who bond through chaos require increasing levels of drama to maintain connection. Your healing threatens this supply, forcing them to either find new sources or confront their own addiction to intensity. Most will choose new sources rather than face the withdrawal of addressing their patterns. The cold shoulder that follows boundary-setting functions as emotional terrorism designed to make you question your right to limits. The withdrawal of warmth, the subtle distancing, the barely perceptible cooling of enthusiasm, all create an atmosphere of punishment without explicit acknowledgement. This passive aggression operates through plausible deniability, allowing the withholder to claim nothing has changed while everything has shifted. Your boundaries require no justification beyond your decision to establish them. The compulsion to provide reasons, to build cases, to earn agreement for your limits reveals a belief that your autonomy is subject to committee approval. But sovereignty does not require consensus. Your no is complete without explanation, valid without agreement, final without negotiation. The continued access to outdated versions of yourself that some people demand represents a form of psychological imprisonment. They insist on relating to who you were rather than who you have become, referencing old patterns, expecting former responses, refusing to update their image despite clear evidence of your change. This insistence on outdated connection reveals their investment in your limitation rather than your growth. The peculiar silence that descends when you stop participating in chaos has a quality unlike any other quiet. Those who once called daily now forget you exist. Conversations that seemed essential evaporate without trace. The crises that required your immediate intervention somehow resolve themselves without your involvement. This is not rejection, but revelation. You are never needed for resolution, only for participation in the performance of perpetual emergency. The morning arrives when checking for their response no longer occurs to you. Not through conscious decision or practiced discipline, but through a fundamental shift in what matters. The elaborate mental conversations you once rehearsed, the explanations you refined, the defenses you prepared, all dissolve into irrelevance. Your energy, no longer leaked into imaginary confrontations, returns to you like blood returning to sleeping limbs. The committed misunderstanding that some people maintain serves a specific function in their psychological economy. If they truly heard you, they would need to acknowledge their behavior. If they genuinely understood your perspective, they would face pressure to change. By maintaining strategic confusion, they preserve their position while appearing to engage. They ask the same questions repeatedly, not from inability to comprehend, but from refusal to accept what comprehension would demand. Those who provoke reactions and then criticize your response operate from a particular form of manipulation that depends on your self-doubt. They push until you react, then focus entirely on your reaction rather than their provocation. This sleight of hand makes you the problem, transforms their aggression into your sensitivity, converts their violation into your overreaction. The game continues only as long as you accept responsibility for emotions they deliberately triggered. The dangerous territory of self-gaslighting emerges from internalized voices that were never yours to begin with. You question your own perceptions, doubt your legitimate feelings, minimize your actual experiences. The voice saying you expect too much, that you should be grateful for crumbs, that your standards are unreasonable. These are recordings of others' limitations played back on internal loop. Recognizing these voices as foreign rather than fundamental begins the process of reclamation. Self-abandonment wears such convincing disguises that its recognition requires careful observation. It presents as generosity when you give beyond capacity. It appears as spirituality when you transcend rather than acknowledge hurt. It masquerades as love when you disappear to maintain connection. These behaviors receive social approval, even praise, making their dysfunction harder to recognize. Society rewards those who sacrifice themselves, then wonders why so many feel empty. The label of difficult that gets applied when you stop self-destructing reflects others' discomfort with your newfound stability. You are not actually harder to be around. You had simply stopped being easy to exploit. Your unwillingness to absorb others' emotions, to accept less than reciprocity, to pretend satisfaction with crumbs. These changes threaten those who benefited from your previous state. Their discomfort with your health is not your pathology to solve. People who never developed boundaries of their own experience yours as violence. They have lived in a world of unlimited access, where no men try harder, where boundaries were suggestions to overcome. Your firm limits feel like attacks because they cannot conceive of relationships that include separation. They interpret your autonomy as abandonment, your self-care as selfishness, your independence as betrayal. Understanding someone deeply does not create obligation to tolerate their behavior. You can comprehend their wounds, recognize their patterns, feel compassion for their struggle, and still choose to protect yourself from their impact. Empathy without boundaries becomes enablement. Understanding without limits becomes self-sacrifice. Compassion must include yourself in its circle of care, or it becomes another form of self-abandonment. The sacred act of choosing yourself while loving another challenges every romantic myth culture promotes. Real love does not require self-erasure. It does not demand that you become less so another can feel like more. It does not ask you to shrink your light to avoid triggering another's shadow. Love that requires your diminishment is not love, but consumption dressed in romantic language. When your absence creates more disturbance than your pain ever did, the truth about the relationship becomes undeniable. They did not miss your presence, but your service. They did not mourn losing you, but losing what you provided. The version of you they claim to miss is the one who asked for nothing, who accepted everything, who confused endurance with devotion. That person was never real, only performed, and the performance has ended. The boredom that healthy people inspire in those addicted to chaos reveals the different frequencies they inhabit. Your stability reads as dullness to those who need constant stimulation. Your peace appears as emptiness to those who require perpetual motion. Your clarity sounds like simplicity to those who thrive in confusion. They will seek more dramatic connections, and this is not loss, but liberation. The exhaustion required to maintain someone else, as version of love finally becomes more painful than the loneliness of walking away. When loving them requires you to perform rather than exist, when their care depends on your careful management of their emotions, when connection means constant vigilance against triggering their wounds, the relationship has become a job you never applied for and cannot resign from through conventional means. The ultimate manifestation of self-respect arrives not with fanfare, but with quiet certainty. You stop needing them to understand why you left. You release the desire for acknowledgement of harm caused. You abandon the quest for apologies that would never truly heal what was broken. The closure you sought from them becomes something you give yourself through the simple act of choosing to be done. This final truth makes all others possible. The privilege of becoming yourself is purchased through grief. You mourn who you might have been if you had not spent so long being who others needed. You grieve relationships that could have been real if you had known how to be real within them. You release the person who accepted so little for so long. And in this grief, in this profound letting go, something extraordinary begins. You become magnetic to those who recognize truth, who have done their own deep work, who celebrate rather than fear your depth. Your life reorganizes around authenticity rather than accommodation. And for the first time, perhaps ever, you rest in the simple, revolutionary act of being exactly who you are.